we're going to get into this book right now. It's called The Mystic Symbol, Mark of the Michigan Mound Builders. And this is the image it has. I'm going to show you a little better image. That's what's in the middle. Some more of the image in the front. Again, the Mystic Symbol, Mark of the Michigan Mound Builders. This is by Henriette Mertz. Here we have another artifact. As you guys can see, almost appears like with a mohawk or like a Roman helmet. You see what I was saying in my Iroquois Roman video about the hairstyle and about what they're really depicting and drawing. And here's another of the tablets. Again, all this is found in Michigan, guys. It says here in the preface, sometime in the late 1980s, I was introduced to the most curious artifacts I had seen to date, the Michigan plates. Dr. James P. Schertz, a professor of civil engineering at University of Wisconsin, Madison, educated me on these artifacts and their controversial history. To myself, listening to the story of discovery, the first thing that kept turning over in my mind was the huge extent of the find throughout Michigan. The most conservative estimate is 10,000 artifacts, which could be as high as 30,000 total pieces. As Dr. Schertz continued to relay this story to me, the second impression I had was the logistics of the whole discovery. A total of 17 known counties in which the artifacts were recovered. Copper items made from the copper mines of the Keweenaw Peninsula, black slate mine from an open pit near Baraga, then hundreds of mounds worked and prepared with finished artifacts literally covering the state of Michigan, and many of the mounds had human remains discovered with the artifacts. Who could do all this to perpetrate a joke or fraud for dollars without being seen or found out prior to 1848? That's a good question. Like, who would go through all that trouble just to play a joke? It don't make sense. Make it make sense. Who? How? Why? After a long fight between scholars of the day, supporting both sides, the find was determined to be a hoax perpetrated on the American public. All right, this is what they officially tell everybody. The entire find was dismissed as a fraud by someone in authority and is parodied by followers within that discipline with no examination of the data. So they just totally disregarded. Remember, this does not fit where they're out of Africa, out of Mesopotamia, theories. So they have to, hide this. They have to disregard it. That's why they're doing it. This method is referred to as ipsi dixit. The following is quoted from Dr. Schertz's own published work on the travesty of the Michigan find and all other artifacts that pointed to an old world connection. Again, we're just talking about the true old world before Columbus. In the 1800s, he says, academic authorities and archaeologists in North America seem to have agreed on a policy not to allow people from Europe to this land, especially by boat. Before our hero Christopher Columbus, this can be likened to the so-called Monroe Doctrine, which states that America is for Americans and European influence will not be allowed. This policy can be traced to Major Powell, a former Civil War officer hired by the Smithsonian Institute to study Indians and Indian mounds and settle once and for all the question of the origin of the mound builders of the New World. We might question Powell's scholarship, but he was extremely effective in putting an end to the mound builder controversy that was then creating such excitement in the land. His politically acceptable solution was that there had not been major influence from the Old World on the mound builders, even though his archaeologists found the Bad Creek stone in an Indian mound that had obvious Phoenician-based letters on it. All right, so real quick, this is the guy saying, how could he not know there was an Old World connection because they're finding literally Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions over here. That's what they're calling Phoenician. So that doesn't mean people came over from the other side and brought that here, though. This is why we got to dodge the hijack. Always, guys, as we go, they're seeing all this in reverse. The point I'm trying to show is that there's more corroboration always that they're finding all this old world inscription stuff, building artifacts, inscriptions, here in America, and they can't prove it came from anywhere else. That's conjectures. Continuing what he was saying, Powell's people dismissed the stone as merely having letters similar to those of the Cherokee alphabet, which had been used to print newspaper for the Cherokee tribe before their forced move west of the Mississippi over the infamous Trail of Tears. A fair analysis of this important piece of reliable basic data, the Bat Creek Stone, would lead the thinking scholar to a conclusion quite different than the strong emotional beliefs which originate from Powell's work. After Powell published his conclusions, an American army which was still fighting in the Indian Wars continued driving the natives from their land without guilt. They might feel if they thought themselves somehow related to the refugees. The Indian Wars were fought, and their land was essentially all taken. But the influence of Powell is with us still in our universities, public institutions, libraries, and bookstores. After it was concluded that Europeans with their boats had not influenced the mound builders, the next question was, how did the Indians get to this land? Since it was believed by many that they had to have come sometime after the fall of the Tower of Babel, about 2000 BC. Dodge the hijack. This is the true old world and the oldest land coming out of the primordial waters. The theory that ancestors of all Indians walked over the Bering Strait after the last glacier about 1300 BC was the answer that caught on, all right? And that's so much hijack, right? This theory was also politically attractive because now all the Indians would be distantly related to people such as the Huns and not the Europeans who wanted the land of the American Indians. You see that? Misclassify them, tell them they're from somewhere else, and then take their land. The Bering Straits theory has been taught as a fact in our schools and to the Native Americans, even though these people still have many native traditions to the contrary. I have heard Indians laugh at the theories of the archaeologists and anthropologists in a manner similar to how anthropologists often laugh at the native verbal traditions. The Bering Straits theory was unquestioned dogma in the schools of our land until the last year, when it has been fairly challenged. But traditions from various tribes state that the natives knew of lands beyond both the eastern and western seas, from which people often came to visit and trade before the days of Columbus. They came as guests and did not conquer and take the land. These verbal histories and traditions, contrary to what is taught in our institutions of higher learning, have been largely ignored by academic authorities and inscribed rocks, which would also challenge the official dogma. Pieces that elsewhere in the world would likely be carefully examined have been dismissed as obvious forgeries and even suppressed from public view, and some finders of such data have undergone character assassinations as well. Between the days of Major Powell and today, thousands of inscribed rocks with obvious old world script and art on them have been dismissed as obvious fakes without anything that would approach a fair analysis of the data or real proof of forgery. For example, Daniel Sulfur, former Secretary of State of Michigan, tried to get scholars in his day to seriously study thousands of inscribed rocks that were being found by amateurs in the Indian mounds near Detroit, Michigan. All right, mounds in Detroit. The academic authorities responded to Sulfur's challenge to their beliefs and authority not with a study, but with an official syndicate designed to discredit Sulfur. They succeeded very well in their stated objective. Sulfur was soundly discredited, and his collection of inscribed rocks and clay tablets has been scattered and many destroyed. Few people, even in Michigan today, know of the affair that once was openly aired in the newspapers of the area near the beginning of the 1900s. America's Pre-Columbian Monroe Doctrine, all right, by James P. Schertz, Professor Emeritus. And so that was me quoting him. That's what he had to say. He's letting you know, a professor, Emeritus, Department of Civil Engineering, Surveying and Mapping Program from the University of Wisconsin. And those newspaper articles he was talking about, remember, we have gone over them. We've read many of them describing what they were finding. Again, shout out to the archivist. All right, Analog 9. It says here in the forward, in 1982, 4 years before Henriette Mertz's book, The Mystic Symbol, was published, posthumously. I had the pleasure of seeing her in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I first presented my research on the 2,100-year-old Hebrew encampment at Hidden Mountain. Listen to this, a 2,100-year-old Hebrew encampment at Hidden Mountain, nearby a site that includes two Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions, one of which is the Ten Commandments. At that time, I had no idea of her background and great accomplishments, being totally ignorant of her work. I heard many comments at that time about her book, The Wine Dark Sea, by those present at the conference of the Western Epigraphic Society. All right, check it out. The Epigraphic Society, we definitely dig what they like, their research. We have read their articles and books and the director's book, Barry Fell. And then we know that they got a lot of influence from the lady, the books who've been reading with the inscriptions found all over the Americas, right? In plain sight, the book we've been reading in plain sight. So the Epigraphic Society definitely involved in proving these are real old world inscriptions. And they're even telling us that what they're finding in the Americas is a more classic version of the inscriptions that they're finding in Europe. It's older versions, meaning more original. Miss Mertz was truly a remarkable woman. As a courtroom expert in handwriting analysis, a military cryptanalysis in World War II, however, I remember her first and foremost as the person that discovered that the Bat Creek stone, which proved to be written in Paleo-Hebrew, a feature she first recognized, had been incorrectly published upside down and misidentified as a Cherokee writing in the official Smithsonian Journal. All right, dodge the hijack. You see, everything is Cherokee. Oh, that was Cherokee. This was no. They just started in the 1700s. What you talking about? Yeah, that's a whole other subject. But again, this lady who's an expert, right? We're not just talking about anybody making stuff. She's an expert military crypto analyst. She's pretty good at inscriptions and handwriting and all that. She straight up told you she's an expert. This was Paleo Hebrew, Bat Creek Stone. You guys know I got mad videos on that. If she had done nothing else in her life, that one small thing would have been worthy of high honor. But she did much more than that. Perhaps 10 years later, I became associated with the Michigan artifacts, as I prefer to call them, and was quickly referred to Henriette's new posthumous work, The Mystic Symbol, by Mrs. Dorothy Hayden of the American Institute for Archaeological Research. Listen, in Mount Vernon, New Hampshire. I read this book and became involved in a many-year study of these artifacts. After much time work and publication of articles in Institute newsletters and journals and articles in Ancient American Magazine, I independently came to the conclusion that these artifacts were created by transplanted. Listen to what he's going to say. He's going to say it in reverse, but this is what he's saying. 4th century Coptic Egyptian Christians. All right, these people are not even supposed to be here. But I'm telling you that these people were here because that's where it really was happening. Ancient Egypt was here. The Holy Land was here. In my years of analysis, I employed an interpretation of the graphic imagery. I am trained professional artist of the pre-Columbian Michigan Society's theology, which is clearly presented on the tablets, usually showing a principal deity called, look at that, Yahuwah, the so-called mystic symbol. The so-called mystic symbol is Hawa, guys. You see that? Oh, Yahuwah, the tentagrammation, right? The so-called mystic symbol, the Most High, a variant of Paleo-Hebrew or even the Assyrian script, what they call it Sumerian, right? Sumerian writing, so-called modern Hebrew. Why? But not in a never before seen cuneiform style, right? Cuneiform style. Yahweh and cuneiform style, what they're calling, right? Sumerian. That's no Sumerian, Assyrian cuneiform. It's a shortened form of, look at that, Hawa, Hiya, Hawa, Yahweh. Where you get Yahweh from? It's I see Hawaii, Hawaii, the name of the creator, father of the Torah, with two subordinate deities, a son of the right hand and a son of the left hand. Now, where are you getting all that from? Now they're going to add the sun. The cops identified these two as high angels, as little Yahoo. Oh, little Yahoo, that's who they're worshiping when you say Jah. It's the angel, not the Most High. Little Yahoo, that's all. Little Yahoo, Yao, Yao, Sabaoth the good, Messiah, son of the right hand, and Samael, listen, the evil Messiah, son of the left hand, Satan. Uh-oh, twin brothers, what is this? Duality, almost like Enlil and Enki, Zeus and Hades, Quetzalcoatl and Shalot. These repetitive graphic elements on the Michigan artifacts clearly identified the creators with the Coptic brand of Christianity. Amazingly, years before, and without the advantage of the Pistis Sophia analysis, which I used, Henriette came to the same conclusion. Amazing is the only word that applies. Miss Mertz was a truly brilliant mind. This identification is an important one because it is probable that the community's theology, graphically incorporated on these tablets and plates, was not known in the modern world by any but a singular German scholar before 1851. In 1895, the 3rd century Coptic, Gnostic, Christian, in parentheses, Pistis Sophia, came to the light of a translation by French Egyptologist and Coptic scholar named Amelino, and was published in French only. For some time previous, about 1851, a German scholar named Schwartzy had an Old Latin version, but was known only to a few European scholars and not published. So a supposed American faker, in parentheses, would have been hard-pressed to know the precise details of Coptic worship and accurately portray them on the tablet previous to 1860s, when Henriette points out on page 9 of this book, the first collections were discovered and viewed in Michigan and New York. So what he's saying is, how would anybody try to fake this and not really know what the Coptics did or how they worship? But you're finding that in the tablets here. It would have to be a very smart historian and expert in Coptic history. That is what he's trying to relate, not just anybody. And also, these people built mounds and stuff, guys. They're finding these tablets inside the mound. So they're trying to say the mounds are fake. They're trying to say the tablets are fake just because they don't even want people to see them. Just seeing them opens up your mind because these are, what looks like tablets from the so-called old world. Right away. Things you're not even supposed to find here. A scholar named Harnack in 1891 pointed out also one or two other vague indications, such as a reference to persecution, from which he concluded that it was written at a date when the Christians were lawfully persecuted. These considerations led him to assign the most probable date of composition to the second half of the 3rd century. In this arcane religious doctrine of these early Gnostic Christian Egyptians called Copts, spelled out in Pistis Sophia, we see that the doctrine portrayed there, in words, is exactly the same as that which is graphically portrayed on the Michigan tablets. That's what they're finding. Yet American-trained archaeologists for the Americas who receive little, if any training in ancient religions and languages, claim they are fakes. These important artifacts were dated by means of a solar eclipse tablet found among the Mertz collection from a small township west of Detroit. Right? This is what they're finding in Detroit. You guys hearing? And reported by myself in a AIAR Institute newsletter article in the early 1990s. The tablet shows a 13-month calendar, typical of the Israelites, because of the occasional need for an intercalary month, which corrects the calendar. The figure of a man's head and nose is pointing at the end of what would be July, 5th of the month in this case, spring, New Year, and meteorites are flying in front of the eclipse. Mertz plate 19. page 139. The timing of this eclipse, I estimated at 325 to 425 AD, somewhat after the Nicene Council in 325 AD, when during the Arian dispute, Egyptian Coptic followers of Bishop Arius Piso, Bishop Arius, would have had compelling reasons to leave the Mediterranean area to escape Constantine's pogroms. The range of time was predicted by me in the article and subsequently confirmed and added to the article when I found the precise eclipse on 27th of July 352 AD at 10:54 a.m. You guys hear how he dated this? It passed directly over where Rowland Township, Isabella County, Michigan, would someday be, and where the artifact at question was later discovered. The factor which makes this case even more astounding is the meteorite depicted in front of the developing eclipse. The date, July 27th, happens to be one of the 2 days of maximum intensity for the annual Delta Aquarid meteor shower. This amounts to a total confirmation of timing and theoretical estimate. Wow, you see, they depicted that on the tablets and they marked the time. Using the same logic I later employed, Henriette identified the correct people and period based on the theological arguments, church councils, and ultimately church pogroms, which caused many people to abandon the Mediterranean about this time. Again, she was right on. Even without the solar eclipse confirmation, the solar eclipse confirmed my thinking, but it also confirmed Henriette's previous logic and conclusions. I believe my published work on these real ancient American artifacts has furthered Henriette Mertz's initial work, started in the first edition of this very book, for which we are all indebted to her. She called the monograms found on virtually all of the enigmatic Michigan artifacts the mystic symbol, hence the title of her book. In a very large sense, she was right. The name Yahweh was clearly used on the Michigan artifacts as a mystic symbol, as a talisman, a logo. All right, the logo is the Most High. You guys get it? The original talisman or logo is the Most High, or as one of the New Age might prefer to call, an avatar. Much symbolic significance was placed on this name, mystic symbol, by the original immigrant society involved with its creation and usage, because we see this name, logo, on all sorts of objects, in no other context than pure symbolic, spiritual power, on pipes, jars, dishes, crowns, swords, and many otherwise mundane and presumably non-religious articles. They're finding the name of the Most High, guys, in cuneiform style. Or that kind of reverence or superstitious power to have become attributed to the mystic monograms, regardless of its religious significance as a name for the deity, Yahweh. It was clearly seen as a talisman with power by these long forgotten folks from the Eastern Mediterranean and from 1600 years ago. All right, so again, seeing it in reverse, he's saying they came from over there because they're finding Hebrew stuff here, so they have to relate it to a fake, Holy Land. But again, guys, apply what we have learned in the last 7 years. This is the true old world. This is the promised land, the Holy Land. All that was right here. That's why they're finding this right here, which is more than 1,000 years before Columbus. Henriette saw the basic implications of this from her distant vantage point. Her work in large part will stand the test of time, even if portions of it may be slightly off track. I refer here to her IHS interpretation, right? They use that in the Catholic and Christian symbology, right? Which is not really justified by virtue of the Coptic context we find ourselves with this vast body of artifacts, neither in time nor theology. Henriette was apparently not privy to this now famous Coptic work, or the name Yahweh, or Yao, example way, Yahweh, or Hawa, Yahweh, HW, right? Add an A between all this, you get Yahweh. Any advancement in knowledge takes time and effort, and even at times intuition. 20 years ago, when Henriette wrote this book, she started something she did not, indeed could not finish. She admitted so particularly with regard to the calendar tablets and battle scenes. Her linguistic work was tentative, but a good start. Since her death and subsequent publication of the first edition of this book, much work has transpired. This author has deciphered one of the four writing systems used on these tablets, the one that resembles cuneiform. It is it really cuneiform? Guys, this is what they're finding here, right? This is a more classic cuneiform. In a strict sense, is this really cuneiform in a strict sense? Not an alphabet of letters, forms easily recognized? Nor is it one of the several known classic types of nail writing. It has been demonstrated in print that the type of cuneiform used here is precisely Paleo Hebrew, Paleo Hebrew, Paleo Hebrew, Hebrew, but executed with the cuneiform nail, quite obviously to encipher the meaning, in case Constantine's agents might someday arrive to enforce the religious pogroms. A good graphic designer might create an entire Roman alphabet with the cuneiform nail approach, something like these Chinese looking characters A, B, C, D, E, F, G, blah, 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 the whole alphabet, right? And they're saying they're Chinese looking. As an example, it is fully readable to those who know the Roman alphabet, but it would be gibberish to American archaeologists that do not recognize Paleo Hebrew had it been presented in that alphabet. The Paleo Hebrew alphabetic decipherment has been published in AIAR 1992 Spring On-Site Journal and later in Ancient American Magazine, issue number 5 from March-April 1994, The Mystic Symbol Demystified by David Allen Deal. All right, that's on page 20 on that. In a recent 2004 issue of Ancient American, issue 9, number 55, page 28, a very readable Egyptian hieroglyphic panel, published by this author as well, may be seen from this same collection of artifacts. This panel with clear Christian motive is additional evidence of a Coptic connection to this 4th century Michigan Christian community, a community that is not supposed to have existed. An additional Egyptian hieroglyphic panel was translated and reported in the AIAR newsletter of July-August 1992, page 10, by this author. All claims by the authoritative Michigan State archaeologists of Ersatz Egyptian hieroglyphics have been roundly proven to be false. All right? They don't want to admit it. There have been and will always be detractors, malefactors, and academic sycophants who followed the rigid path laid out for them by Major Powell of the Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology, right? So again, remember Powell, he works with the Smithsonian. We already know the history of the Smithsonian Institute hiding the real history of America, hiding artifacts, giant bones, all that. So not indifferent here. In the latter half of the 19th century, we may call it the Powell Doctrine here. Essentially, the entire modern anthropological establishment has laid down certain basic ground rules for all artifacts found in the Americas. And listen to this is manifest destiny. That might give the slightest evidence for pre-Columbian contact with the old world. That policy it's all fake, all fraud. This bias in extremis is best evidenced recently when a large group of these artifacts from Michigan called the Soper Savage Collection was graciously and finally returned to the Michigan State by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church authorities who had obtained the collection after the death of a member researcher, Mr. Milton R. Hunter. Mr. Hunter had been given this huge collection by Notre Dame University. That's who had it. Why did Notre Dame have it? Who did not have the slightest idea what to do with it after Father Dean Savage had wiled them the collection, and since the sisal packed barrels were taking up valuable space under the stadium, away they went. Now they are in an official Michigan State Museum, controlled by a sycophantic state archaeologist who hates them, who is just following the Paul doctrine, as every American archaeologist must. All right, so literally telling us there is a gatekeeper, literally assigned to make sure these tablets are not shown to anybody or stay in this box. Literally, how do you involve your emotions and personal feelings when you're an archaeologist? How can you hate artifacts? You guys hear that? He hates them. You get what I'm saying? Like, it's personal. It is personal because they want to maintain a certain narrative, a fake narrative, a fake history. The true old world is here, guys. Wake up. How many more books do I have to read? This massive collection of true and valuable ancient American artifacts are touted by petty state official authority daily to protect the innocent public, quoting the state of Michigan's all-knowing state archaeologists as fakes and a fraudulent part of Michigan's history, but fakes nonetheless. In this writer's much considered opinion, the fake appears to be the Michigan State archaeologist, as usual. All right, he just got him with good. He got him good. He just dropped the bomb on him. He said, "You know what, fake? You're the fake one." What we have here is a catch-22. The fox is in charge of the chicken coop. Joseph Heller could have done a number on this story. Captain Josarian would have been driven right to the point of insanity. To give an idea of the trained bias dogma embroidered into the receptive minds of the newly trained academics flowing out of our institutions of higher learning, in parentheses, year in and year out, against finding any pre-Columbian Old World artifacts here in the Americas, this researcher was recently told by a Bureau of Reclamation archaeologists in Arizona, "We don't use terms such as necropolis here in the Americas. It smacks of Old World archaeology." Since necropolis, in parentheses, is a Greek word used to describe a substantial graveyard or city of the dead, and since it is an Old World term, it abuses the trained anthropologist's senses. The use of such Old World archaeological terms in America might imply that there could have been some nexus or connection between the New World and Old World. There's some connection. What is it? Well, the fact is that this is the Old World, the true Old World. That's what it is. Before Columbus and the magic year of 1492, and the rigidly trained state archaeologist Little Paragon, such scenarios cannot be so. Well, there were pre-Columbian maritime connections, okay, across the Atlantic, and the mystic symbol Michigan artifacts are collectively but one of them. That's just one of them. We've shown so many, guys, all over the Americas. Henriette Mertz presents work on the Michigan Mound Builder monogram. All right, that's the Most High. Yahuwah will stand out as a first strike and point of the spear, assault at creating a major chink in the old, rusted academic Victorian armor of dogma, which will, in time, entropy and conform to the second law of thermodynamics, if there be one for history, and crumble into dust and ashes as it so richly deserves, although none too soon for some of us. Respectfully to the memory of a real diffusionist, Americanist historian, Henriette Mertz. David Allen Dale, 2004. And he's the author of Discovery of Ancient America, which we're going to definitely get into, guys. And we probably have already read it. I know I've read so many books. And then the Nexus Spoken Language, the connection between the old and new world. All right. That's a good one right there. We're going to definitely look for it as well. And, you know, if I tell you we're going to look for these, I'm going to look for them, right? I'm going to probably see it in a future video, see what. So here's one of the tablets that you guys can see. All right. Little by little, see all the inscriptions, the writing. This is what she was saying she recognized. And they're comparing with the Coptic, so-called Egyptian Christians. So we move on to chapter 1. It says here, Ancient Stones. Beginnings are forever shrouded in mystery. Who came first upon our land has no immediate answer. For generation upon generation, proud and dignified Indians freely roamed over the great plains of mid-America, hunting, fishing, gathering berries, and stalking wild buffalo. Suddenly, almost overnight, at the very turn of the 19th century, came catastrophic change. Following in the wake of our Revolutionary War, hordes of land-hungry settlers poured across the Alleghenies to establish homes in fertile river valleys along the Ohio, Muskingum, and Wabash, and soon annihilated that once noble race of red men. In less than half a century, that free and idyllic life of the Miami, the Huron, and the Potawatomi was wiped out and a new era commenced. As these recently come farmers began cultivation of their soil, spades and plows turned up odd pieces of slate, copper, and clay, embedded with tree roots or lying deep in the warm earth, more intent on cultivation of land than on picking up strange objects. Farmers discarded most of this material, assuming it to have been Indian and therefore worthless. A few more knowledgeable among them, however, recognized in some of this material an attempt at writing. What it meant, they could not guess. One recurrent symbol or mark drew their attention, appearing as it seemed on each separate piece. Specimens of these marked objects eventually found their way into hands of scholarly persons, and farmers, eager to have the inscriptions read, entrusted their finds to members of the academic community, who they felt would be capable of interpreting or translating this curiously written matter. It now appears that gross and serious error was committed by those into whose care these specimens were confided, thus resulting in irreparable loss. An academic group not recognizing the writing as having been set down in any letters with which they themselves were familiar, so to save their self-esteem, charged that it was fraudulent. They called attention to the writing, which bore an unmistakable mixture of cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyph, Phoenician, and Greek letters. Without hesitation and needing merely one quick glance, each and every professor agreed that the specimens were rank forgeries, and on that charge they stood unified and immovable. Hundreds of objects, numbering even into thousands, bore inscriptions in some strange writing containing characters which no one who examined them could either read or tell from what language they came, while the academic world remained inflexible, refusing to move from their position that all these artifacts had been forged. A majority of unconvinced Michigan farmers in turn stubbornly refused to believe that anyone had trespassed on their land, secreting this array of inexplicable material. To a farmer, that which he plowed up was not planted on his land at any recent date, regardless of whether or not it could be read. The greater portion of this material does and thereby pass from existence. All right, so even the farmers was like, no, nobody came and dug this. We would have saw it. We would have noticed. It would have been obvious. A vast chasm may exist between a charge of forgery and valid proof that forgery had in fact been committed. No proof of forgery or fraudulent manufacture and sale was ever offered. Accusations in one form or another blistered the lecture platforms and classrooms for years and still continues, the academic world being satisfied to act as its own prosecutor, judge, and jury, recalling the old Chinese proverb, God help the prisoner when the prosecutor and the judge are one and the same man. Formal writing, insofar as we know it, appeared to have evolved both in Egypt and Sumer, roughly about 3000 BC. Starts to hijack. What Egypt? What Sumer? That was all over here. Go check out my philology history videos. Egyptians originated a system in the form of pictures known as hieroglyphic, while Sumerians imprinted wedge-shaped marks on wet clay and what is known to us as cuneiform. So again, no such thing as Sumerian, that was Assyrian script of this cuneiform. Modifications branched off from both systems. Hittites developed their own style of cuneiform. North and South Canaanite separated, each developing different letters. Phoenicians simplified Egyptian hieroglyphics, reducing pictures to a linear form. Remember, we have a video on that, how they turned the Maya glyphs into phonetics, into simple linear form, right? We're talking about hieroglyphics, the Maya hieroglyphics. That was the so-called phonetics, Phoenicians going out into the world. Cretan linear A and B, as well as later Greek, Cypriot, Turdic, Celtiberian, Etruscan, and Messenian created forms of their own. While most of these writings have been deciphered, there yet remains those yet susceptible of being deciphered by any presently known means. Only recently, in 1961, reduction of one of the most enigmatic and crypto-Mycenaean, the Jason tablet of Enkomi, a baked clay tablet recovered on the island of Cyprus, has been transliterated and translated after patient study by Henry Efron, one of our erudite paleographers. Writing provides one of the better means of identifying cultures. The periods when certain styles of writing originated with certain peoples can be determined. Those few remaining pieces from Michigan which still exist will be examined and discussed in later chapters, seeking and suggesting ways and means whereby that strange system of writing might be identified. Unrecognized letters frequently crop up in isolated areas around the globe. When such extraneous characters have appeared in the United States and regions where they were unexpected, the immediate reaction of those presumed appointed experts who examined them was to jump to the conclusion that they had been forged. To explain who forged them and why presents a greater mystery than the artifacts themselves. They can never prove it though. During our colonial days, along the eastern seaboard of the United States, numerous inscribed rocks bewildered early settlers. Notable amongst this material-bearing inscription was the famous Dighton Rock of Massachusetts, which we've talked about. Perhaps no inscription on one single rock found in North America, not even the Kensington stone itself, which contains runic inscriptions, received the attention. According to Dighton Rock, in 1680, a copy was made by Dr. Danforth. Cotton Mather sketched a facsimile in 1712, followed by Dr. Greenwood in 1730. 10 or more persons published drawings before 1830. This particular inscription defied reduction and still remains an enigma today. Along in the 1880s and 1830s, European scholars turned their attention to records of voyages of Norsemen across the North Atlantic, believing that Scandinavians had reached continental North America sometime during the 10th or 11th century. Their study of the Dighton Rock as probable evidence of Norse contact provoked considerable controversy, resulting in a Congress being called to meet in Copenhagen in 1837 to study the matter further. Many notable scholars attended. The Rhode Island Historical Society contributed information by letter, including earlier material examined by Ezra Stiles, late president of Yale College, who had studied graphic rocks in this country, and by 1789 had reported on many huge monoliths inscribed in unknown characters existing here. One of those inscriptions, taken from a rock at Scaticook, Kent County, Connecticut, had been compared with an inscription found on a gravestone near Abakan on the river Yenisei in Siberia. The Historical Society reports also called attention to other stone inscriptions along Lake Erie, on the Allegheny River, below Fort Pitt, on the Connecticut River near Battleboro, on the Altamaha in Georgia, and all along the Cumberland River, where many large rocks existed standing in vertical positions charged with unknown characters. All right, guys, we've shown so many of what they're talking about and much more, right? All these inscriptions all over the place. However, no conclusions concerning such inscriptions satisfied everyone at the Congress of 1837, so the matter rested. In the interval between 1837 and 1875, scores of other inscribed stones turned up in areas from the eastern seaboard to as far west as the Mississippi River. This backwoods region was open to settlement following the Revolutionary War, and farmers moving in from the east, bewildered by the number of inscribed stones uncovered by their plows, hopefully turned them over to the academic community, trusting that they might learn what peoples had trod their soil at an earlier age. Since most of these marked stones bore letters unfamiliar to those who examined them, charges of forgery instantly arose, pointing a finger at the farmer who had plowed them up. Of the scores of such pieces recovered, no single piece was at any time held to be authentic. All were charged as forgeries. A so-called policy was thus established classifying any and all inscribed material as fraudulent, dismissing it without further study. Again, as in the earlier period of the 1830s, the situation within the scholarly world of Europe bethought itself of a different view. Filtering through scholars abroad, news of many finds found a more receptive ear. Following the Congress in Copenhagen, the French particularly disinclined to accept conclusions by others than members of their own academy, and believing their study indicated that many of these inscribed stones found in America were authentic, and that while forgery had been alleged, it had never been proven, called a Congress to meet in Nancy, France, on 19th of July, 1875, for the purpose of examining controversial finds in the United States. Scholars from the countries stretching from Japan, of Turkey, from Algeria, and the Canary Islands responded to the call, as did two official representatives sent by the United States government. At this Congress, I wonder if it was in one of these world fairs, 16 articles of organization were formulated and adopted. This Congress, known as the International Congress of Americanists, listen to what they probably decided, had for its purpose the contribution to the progress of study of ethnography, linguistics, writing, and historic relations of the two Americas during the pre-Columbian period. The deliberations of these early congresses took a spirited turn as inscribed stone after inscribed stone received attention. During this time, the academic community of the United States exhibited little or no interest, although individuals, primarily doctors of medicine and lawyers, contributed papers. In the same year of 1875, Dr. Daniel Wilson of Toronto, who had been seriously interested in the problem of inscribed material as evidence of pre-Columbian contact of Europe with America, queried, "Has no memorial of ancient Phoenician or Carthaginian, Egyptian, Greek, or younger Norse voyager survived as a voice of the past to tell of such early intercourse between the Old World and the New?" Several inscribed stones from America will be reviewed in a later chapter, those on which debate arose during early international congresses, well known in the archaeological field but practically unknown to a major portion of persons in the United States. Inscribed stones found here include the Kensington stone of Minnesota and the Havner stone of Arkansas, the inscribed copper plates found by Joseph Smith in Palmyra, New York, the so-called ironstones said to be in Phoenician letters found near Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, the Grave Creek stone of West Virginia, the Holy Stone said to be in Hebrew found in Ohio, the stone found in a mound in Loudoun County, Tennessee, in Phoenician characters or Paleo-Hebrew, and the many hundreds of inscribed artifacts of stone, copper, and slate from Michigan. And again, I've shown you guys all of these artifacts. I know all these artifacts they're talking about. I can picture them in my head, can you? Old world inscriptions found here in all these parts of North America. All right, so we're gonna move on to chapter 2. Try to get one more chapter in today. It says here, the controversy, chapter 2. And again, we're in the book, The Mystic Symbol, Mark of the Michigan Mound Builders. And it says here, the controversy, chapter 2. One crisp spring morning in 1874, a farmer newly arrived from the east, clearing timber nearby the village of Crystal in central Michigan, northwest of Detroit, unearthed a beautifully worked piece of black slate in the form of a shuttle covered with curious markings adjacent to a drawing of a man's head wearing queerly fashioned headgear. Within the course of the next few months, additional unexplainable pieces came to light in an area between the villages of Crystal, St. Louis, and Edmore. A copper stiletto, a small clay box, and a large slate tablet, each bearing undecipherable markings together with some strange-looking cryptic characters. Wonderment stirred the community, never suspecting that any large group other than Indians had preceded them on this land, tucked away in the heart of Michigan. Farmers in Montcalm and Gratiot counties stood in profound amazement at this assortment of copper tools, picture tablets, spear points, and bracelets now spread before them. How could such an unrecognizable material come to have been buried in this sparsely populated farming community? Who, they asked, might have buried them? Were they remains of a race long since wiped out? Certain it was that human beings once occupied this land. Here was tangible evidence made by human hands, markings unmistakably bespoke a writing. No one could read it. Wonderment spread as a bewildered countryside found itself the center of a nationwide attention. Curiosity seekers flocked to the tiny village. Everyone offered suggestions. Some bethought the marks to be Egyptian, offering pictures from their encyclopedias. Others, equally certain the marks stemmed from Hebrew, countered with samples from their Bibles. All right, so real quick, let's look at the figure they were talking about, what they found here. All right, this is what they're finding here, guys. In Michigan, in parts in Detroit, all these areas, right? Look at that, the mark of the Most High here, as we read earlier. That looks almost like Egyptian, so-called, right? If the writing were Hebrew, could this then be remains of one of the so-called lost tribes? Many thought so. Imagination soared. Into this early perplexed community came Professor J.O. Kinnerman, editor of the American Antiquarian and Oriental Journal, living in the nearby Berrien Springs, to investigate on his own. As did others. He stood speechless in astonishment, recognizing certain resemblances to Egyptian. He was yet aware of great differences, so much so as to be frankly embarrassed by being unable to offer adequate explanation. Many years later, during the course of the 1910 heated controversy, Professor Kinnerman took occasion to refer to this early period in the 1870s and 1880s with which he himself had been familiar. Between 1870 and 1920, farmers from 17 counties in Michigan stumbled across footprints of this strange people, and from these finds, 7 major collections developed. Some 125 miles southeast of Crystal, in the Detroit area, another large group of identically marked material turned up in the 1860s to the 1880s. Much of this fell into the hands of Professor Edwin Worth, unbeknown to farmers in Montcalm County. The Wayne County specimens were exhibited in Detroit by Professor Worth in his privately owned museum, later moving his exhibit to New York. His collection was on display there for about 40 years, desiring to retire to be near his only living relative, a sister, when nearing 70 years of age in 1906. He purchased land near Springport, Indiana, where he built a large frame museum as permanent home. Records indicate that Professor Worth started collecting as a small boy in 1848. In addition to inscribed stones, he also had an extensive coin collection, an outstanding collection of fine Oriental pearls, and the head of the assassin of President Garfield. During the years in Springport, his museum became famous, so much so that on Sunday in summer as many as 600 persons streamed through the museum to look at this fantastic collection. In 1916, Professor Worth's museum burned. From the ashes of that fire, some 20 pieces of this inscribed material from Michigan were recovered by Tad Wilson. 5 of those pieces were sold to Philip Scupp of Chicago in 1924. Photograph of those scarred remains appears here as Plate 1. Earlier excitement and curiosity sparked by Franklin's 1874 find in Crystal barely subsided when consternation and furor burst upon Wyman, Montcalm County. This was the famous find of James O. Scortford in 1890, the find over which bitter controversy seethed for some 30 years. This was the yard which was later to become associated with the notorious Soper frauds, the group of artifacts that sent mercurial tempers soaring. So it had happened in the late fall of 1890 that a young hired hand digging post holes on the Davis farm near Wyman spaded up a clay jar covered with peculiar marks. James Scotford, who, as most persons raised in backcountry, at this time had little formal education, could not have been expected to recognize the strange markings. He did recognize that it was not Indian, for Indian material he knew well. All right, so real quick, let's just go back so we can see some of the stuff they're finding here, guys, okay? All right, let me just zoom in. This is what they're finding here in Detroit, all right? Michigan, the name of the Most High, a whole story being told. You got a little bit of Paleo-Hebrew, a little bit of Egyptian, a little bit of cuneiform, a little bit of everything, because it's the true old world. Got a little castle here. You got some other artifacts here. Right here, you can see a sphinx over here on the left, right? A sphinx with a jaguar. See that? You see the spots? That's a jaguar. A sphinx. Oh yeah. So these 5 copper pieces came from collection of Edwin Forth, started sometime in the 1850s, and were 5 of 10 pieces first submitted to me for examination. The other pieces were slate. Curiosity seekers flocked to the Davis farm to look at the odd jar, and again persons satisfied themselves that markings must be Egyptian hieroglyphics, or as some thought, Hebrew or even Greek. Scotford's find sparked a chain reaction of unprecedented controversy, followed with interest by archaeologists, particularly in Europe, amongst groups who had earlier raised questions concerning inscribed artifacts dug from American soil. Before the year 1890 ended, Scotford had dug up a score of more objects, each bearing an identical cryptic mark. Persons from Stanton, the county seat, interested in what they assumed to be a fantastic remains of some ancient race inhabiting the very land on which they lived, formed a small society to study Scotford's material. Photographs hopefully were sent to universities and museums throughout the United States, trusting that someone somewhere might recognize the markings as writing and identify the objects. No one could. Instead, back came heartbreaking answers, one after another, that all pieces were spurious. Not one was authentic. Typical of reactions came from Professor Alfred Emerson of Lake Forest College, who replied, "The articles were bad enough in the photograph. Examination proved them to be humbug of the first water. They were all of unbaked clay and decorated with bogus hieroglyphics in which cuneiform characters appeared at intervals. These were all stamped by way of economizing labor. The characters were turned upside down or laid sideways." Disillusionment brought on by disheartening replies dampened enthusiasm, and within a few months, the little Archaeological Society of Stanton, which started out with so much hope, disbanded. Adding to this widespread confusion, Francis W. Kelsey, professor of Latin on the faculty of the University of Michigan, contributed an article to The Nation under date of 28 January 1892, denouncing the material as fraudulent. Professor Kelsey titled his article, "Archaeological Forgeries at Wenham, Michigan." In his own words, he told the following story. Wyman, Michigan, is a small village on the Stanton branch of the Detroit, Lansing and Northern Railroad, about 60 miles northwest of Lansing. It is a region from which in recent years the pine woods have been cut away. Only a small portion of the land is under cultivation, and as the sawmills have been removed, the country presents a desolate appearance. The ground is covered with low, rounded elevations, a few feet across, most of which were produced by the uprooting of trees in time past and decaying of roots in the soil around them. Among these are larger, sepulchral mounds of an aboriginal population, which yield human bones and a few Neolithic remains of the common sort. The soil is sandy. In October 1890, a man digging post holes in a field near Wyman found a small cup of unbaked clay. In the spring and summer of 1891, other discoveries were made, and the inhabitants of the region passed into a state of great excitement, which was hardly yet subsided. 3 or 4 archaeologists have pronounced the relics forgeries, yet a considerable number of people believe in them. The favorite explanation is that these objects are the remains of a colony that in a remote period found its way to Michigan from the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates. 3 pieces recently came into the possession of the University of Michigan: a sphinx, a vase, and a tablet. These were taken from a low mound near Wyman. In view of the perishable quality of the clay, the slight elevation of the mound, the nearness to the surface of the objects, and the amount of yearly rainfall in this region, it is clear that the objects could not have been in the ground more than 1 year. Here is evidence, then, of a deliberate and laborious attempt at imposition. Is this the work of an unbalanced religious fanatic, for whom some prophet will arise in due time and interpret the supposed mystic symbol into a new creed? Following Professor Kelsey's article, an independent opinion rendered by Professor Morris Jastrow, Jr., leading anthropologist on the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania, confirmed in principle that which Professor Kelsey had contended. In part, Professor Jastrow stated, "In view of the wide publicity given to the report of the discovery of Assyrian antiquities in a Michigan mound, I beg of you to announce that the tablets and monuments claimed to have been excavated are willful forgeries, remarkable only for their clumsy character and the great ignorance betrayed by the forger. Photographs of the objects have been sent to me, and a glance is sufficient to reveal the true character of the find. The inscriptions are largely a horrible mixture of Phoenician, Egyptian, and Egyptian Greek characters, taken at random from a comparative table of alphabets such as is found at the back of Webster's dictionary. As for the cuneiform characters found on one of the tablets, they are in the main variations of a single letter, which the forger happened to stumble across, perhaps in the article Cuneiform of Appleton's Encyclopedia, while the sculptures, which include a sphinx of an Irish cast of features, are evidently copied from some illustrated handbook on archaeology. It is surprising that any sensible person should have been for one moment deceived by so evident a fraud, and yet a correspondent writes that there are some 57 affidavits testifying to the genuineness of the discovery, just 56 more than there ought to be." After publication of these 2 articles, national interest that had bathed Montcalm County in an unexpected aura of publicity subsided, and fever-pitched excitement gradually tapered off, enwrapping the tiny village of Wyman once again in a veil of obscurity. So, because these 2 experts, they disagreed with it just without disproving it. They discredited the finds, they disregarded them, they said they were frauds. Everybody believed them, and this was forgotten. Then, sometime around 1907, oddly marked objects for the second time started to appear in the Detroit area. The earlier museum collection of Professor Worth, long since removed from Detroit to New York, passed from memory of an older generation. Precise location and circumstances under which the first of this second series of objects was found do not appear to have been recorded, resulting in 3 or 4 independent versions. Excerpt from a letter many years after the event, dated 28th of October, 1924, written by Reverend James Savage, recites the finding as he remembered hearing it from Daniel Soper, the evening Soper made the original find. Therefore, it is Reverend Savage's account that we shall follow as being written as nearly contemporaneous with the find as would be possible. His letter in part stated, "I am old man and have collected Indian artifacts a long number of years. I have between 9 and 10,000 Indian artifacts. I have never sold, nor do I intend to sell an article. I have also some 700 specimens of these artifacts of which you are making inquiry. I think it was in 1906, Mr. Danny Soper, rambling through the woods, then north of Detroit, saw a large pile of sand, more than a ton, thrown out from the side of a hillock, on which stood the trunk of a large basswood tree. The trunk was not dead, broken off with some 3 large shoots sprung from the roots, which made the digging more difficult. It struck me it was where a large woodchuck intruded, making his winter quarters. It had rained that morning, and the fragments of pottery the animal threw out were washed off, and Mr. Soper noticed the writing and marking on these fragments. He went home, got his man, and opened what proved to be a mound or burial place of a prehistoric people. This mound contained a clay lamp, dip lamp, a box, and with 3 copper spears. If I remember, the box was slate. This was the first of his finds of this prehistoric people. In a letter dated 14 January 1910, Mr. Soper gave the date of his first find as October 1907, not 1906 as Reverend Savage thought. That same October evening of his first find, Mr. Soper went to consult with his good friend Reverend James Savage, pastor of the Most Holy Trinity Church, 1050 Porter Street, Detroit, an amateur archaeologist whose letter in part has been quoted above. Intrigued by the unfamiliar markings, Mr. Soper and Dean Savage pored over this strangely marked material until nearly morning. Under no circumstances could Dean Savage be considered a mere novice at examining material. Although an amateur archaeologist, he commanded respect in a field where few, if any, professionals outranked him. Dean Savage had been a collector of Indian artifacts from the time that he was a small boy. He accumulated and classified a collection of between 9 and 10,000 specimens, acknowledged as the finest collection of Indian material of that day in the Midwest. He knew Indian craftsmanship perfectly, and he instantly recognized that the material spread before him matched nothing in his vast collection. Both Dean Savage and Mr. Soper were at a complete loss. Scotford, meanwhile, having come to Detroit, read newspaper accounts of strange objects that had been found in and around Detroit, bearing 3 wedge-shaped characters which he recognized as being similar to those that he found in Montcalm County some 16 years earlier. Scotford immediately arranged for a meeting with Mr. Soper and Dean Savage. Thereafter, and within a comparatively short span of time, these 3 men working together located and excavated over 500 mounds primarily around Detroit. Guys, 500 mounds just in Detroit alone. All right? Come on. True old world. Into this bizarre and puzzling picture of 1910 came Rudolf Etzenhauser, a general missionary for the Church of Latter-day Saints. Bishop Etzenhauser, as he was known, published a brochure of 40 pages of photographs showing a portion of material he himself had gathered together along with photographs of objects excavated by Mr. Soper and Dean Savage. Believing sincerely in the genuineness of his material, as well as that which Mr. Soper and Dean Savage had excavated, Bishop Etzenhauser started on a nationwide lecture tour during the course of which he proclaimed his tablets and artifacts to be the finest collection of prehistoric relics ever exhibited in the United States. Academic circles believing the entire group of artifacts to be forgeries ridiculed this brazen intrusion into the archaeological field with animosity mounting higher on each succeeding Etzenhauser lecture. National publicity accorded Bishop Etzenhauser irritated Professor Kelsey, who railed at this unforeseen turn of events, sensing that his reputation, as well as his article published in 1892, had been assailed. Professor Kelsey marshaled his forces to do battle, enlisting cooperation from a group of academic friends, outstanding professors, and museum directors. Professor Kelsey proposed to liquidate the men who he alleged manufactured and sold this fraudulent material. Sufficient money was collected to provide for formation of a formal syndicate. Once organized, this syndicate sponsored articles which appeared from time to time in the American Anthropologist and other journals of similar professional interests. By nature, leaders of these 2 opposing factions, Professor Kelsey on one side and Mr. Soper on the other, were men of strong temperament, domineering and arrogant, both supremely egotistical, headstrong, and argumentative. Each instinctively felt total repugnance toward the other. Professor Kelsey, having taken the initiative, felt duty-bound by reason of his position on the faculty of the university to curb spreading rumors that enticed the gullible public into misbelief that these artifacts were authentic. Aided by C.E. Brown of the Wisconsin Historical Society, the director of the Detroit Art Museum, as well as the newly formed syndicate, A wide-scale program designed to re-educate the public soon materialized, right? Re-educate, remember what they do to us in schools. Importance attached to this undertaking was of such magnitude that a handpicked group from various universities and museums was called together for conference to plan strategy and combating the unquenchable Mr. Soper and Bishop Etzenhauser. Professor Kelsey himself addressed the opening session, which was held in Chicago. From the platform, Professor Kelsey, Professor G.B. Brown of the University of Pennsylvania, Professor W.K. Moorhead of Phillips Andover Academy, and others spoke at considerable length, increasingly disturbed by the contemptuous attitude of the two men, their arrogance and persistence. At this first meeting of the conference, the group unified in concluding that Schofield alone had been guilty of willfully forging the material, that Mr. Soper and Bishop Etzenhauser were conspirators. These Savage, they concluded, had been innocently led astray. Professor J.O. Kinnerman, who had examined Mr. Franklin's 1874 collection of this material, as noted above, was present on the platform during the first meeting, but desiring to remain neutral, inconceivably sat mute, making no comment of any nature from that platform. In his article published in the first issue for 1911 of the American Antiquarian and Oriental Journal, Professor Kinnerman wrote, "Long before the first date mentioned by Professor Kelsey, 1890, we knew the existence of and examined personally many of the same kind of finds mentioned in above article. In a small hamlet of Crystal, Montcalm County, Michigan, resided a gentleman by the name of Franklin, a very aged man even at that time, but a devotee of American archaeology. This man has for years been a collector, and his collection has so large that a special building had been erected to house it. Quite a fortune had been expended by him in his efforts to solve the riddle of America's prehistoric peoples. Among his collection were clay tablets that especially attracted our attention, one of which was designated by Mr. Franklin as the Deluge Tablet. This tablet was of baked clay 22 by 7, divided into two sections. Many copper relics were in the collection, including axes, spears, knives, and objects for which no known use could be assigned. Also incense burners, caskets, pipes, and figurines. In 1891, we repeated our visit, taking notes and even squeezes which we have been so unfortunate as to have destroyed. Again in 1901, we visited Mr. Franklin. On this occasion, he presented us with 3 coins which we still have. We showed them to Professor Dorsey of the Field Museum in Chicago. He, without due consideration, at once in an impulsive way, pronounced them a fraud. We are not going to take sides and express our opinion at this stage of the discussions, but we will say that if Mr. Franklin was duped, he was so unknowingly, for he spent thousands of dollars making his collection. An archaeologist may be critical and conservative, but yet he may be too impulsive in the expression of his preconceived hypothesis and thus be blinded to the truth even when it is thrust at him." So wrote Professor J.O. Kinnerman in 1911. At his second formal meeting, a committee was appointed to proceed to Michigan on behalf of the syndicate to investigate and observe excavation of a mound. Professor Frederick Starr, well known and much beloved anthropologist on the faculty of the University of Chicago, placed on the committee at special request of the Chicago Examiner, was accompanied to Michigan by Roswell Field of the editorial staff of that daily newspaper. Due to unusual circumstances surrounding the investigation, the Mormon Church had particular interest in the controversy, and they delegated Dr. James E. Talmadge, director of the Deciphering Museum of Salt Lake City, as a member of the committee to represent the Mormon Church. At the outset, it seemed apparent that individual members of the committee found their duty an unpleasant one. Mr. Soper's attitude had been exasperating, making it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to maintain an objective viewpoint. Into that disquieting atmosphere, the committee arrived in Detroit. Later that same day, they participated in the opening of 2 mounds, within which 5 relics were found. Professor Starr rendered an official report on behalf of the committee. His report, published in the American Antiquarian and Oriental Journal, summarized findings of the official committee and in part stated, "The two mounds we opened were undisturbed and brush grown. They had not yet been prepared against our coming, nothing had been planted in them. 7 or 8 of us looked on. All agree that usually only one mound in 8 or 10 contains anything. Both ours were productive. What of our objects? 1. None of the 5 is old, yet each bears the mystic sign. 2. None of them had laid in the earth for any time. 3. One of which I removed at Scottford's request with my own hands could have been at the place from which I took it 2 minutes before. This I can demonstrate to anyone, even to an intelligent child of 10 years. These 5 objects were not planted in the mound. They were introduced as we looked on, and one would not need to be a skilled sleight of hand man to do it." So wrote Professor Starr. While Professor Starr reported that neither of the mounds had been disturbed or prepared prior to their coming, nor had any of the 5 objects recovered been planted in advance, yet he denounced Mr. Scottford as being a prestidigitator who introduced the relics as the 8 or 10. Professors anxiously watched that the sleight of hand was so quick none of the group sent there for the very purpose of observation and with eyes glued to the spot saw it happen. So they pretended they didn't see them pull it out of the mound and nobody planted it there. Professor Starr's official report on behalf of the committee was accepted by the syndicate and published without question in the same issue of the American Antiquarian and Oriental Journal. 2 other articles treating of these alleged forgeries were published, one by Professor Kelsey and the second by Professor John Andrew Russell. Tucked away within the complex array of charge and countercharge of bitter denunciation and defying opponents, yet another still small voice emerged from the wilderness. Professor Russell, who originally concluded that this material had been forged, now changed his mind and expressed his growing awareness that all was far from being settled. His article reflected a strongly held opinion contrary to that of the remainder of the academic community, due solely to his position. His article received publication for what it might be worth, with no comment. In his article, curiously enough, Professor Russell championed the cause of Mr. Soper and Dean Savage. In his opening statement, he acknowledged that he had been among the original group censoring both the man and the relics, but after prolonged study and exhaustive investigation on his own part, he reversed his original opinion and was now prepared to state that his later extensive findings had convinced him that the specimens were genuine. His lengthy detailed description of the objects and conditions under which they had been found appears to be the only source published in which the material itself was treated. Aside from opinions expressed in his article, Professor Russell set down many surrounding circumstances that preserved invaluable historical information regarding these relics not found in any other place. Objective of the syndicate founded by Professor Kelsey had ample publicity and now reflected changed attitudes on the part of the public changes, for which the syndicate had fervently hoped. Their meetings had been preeminently successful, and they were agreed amongst themselves that the public had been protected against irresponsible peddlers of fraudulent material. Having thus accomplished its purpose, the syndicate disbanded. Adverse publicity surrounding the 4 men against whom the syndicate waged their campaign gradually waned. Yet from 1912 to 1920, Mr. Soper, Dean Savage, and Mr. Scottford quietly continued with their program of excavation without further molestation. Insofar as records indicate, the last known mound opening, the digging of which Mr. Soper supervised, took place on September 20, 1920, at Halfway, a small hamlet near Detroit. Mr. Soper being then 79 years of age, 3 mounds were opened that day in the presence of Mr. Soper, Dean Savage, Mr. Scottford, Dr. R.B. Orr, director of the Museum of Toronto, Canada, Major James of the same museum, Harry L. Spooner, an amateur archaeologist, and Mr. Spooner's small son, Al. Mr. Spooner observed that none of the mounds had been disturbed prior to their digging, On that September day in 1920, atop the third mound grew a large beech tree, which he described as very slow growing and appearing to him to have been well over 100 years old. Enormous roots had to be cut in order to excavate and embedded deeply within the tangled network of two roots, a beautifully carved stone pipe came to light. Four superb heads as exquisite as anything he had ever seen. Mr. Spooner remembered that Dr. Orr asked for the pipe as a specimen to display in the museum, and he put it in his coat pocket, taking it back with him to Toronto. Some 2 years after this dig at Halfway, Mr. Soper died. In 1924, Mr. Phillips Scopp of Chicago obtained directly from Pat Wilson of Springport, Indiana, 5 remaining pieces of copper recovered from Professor Edwin Worth's museum fire. As noted above, Mr. Scoops, a collector of Indian and other artifacts, became fascinated by inscriptions on these copper pieces and instituted correspondence with Dean Savage. In October 1924, Dean Savage wrote to Mr. Scoop, summing up his activity. This letter, a portion of which was quoted above, appears to be the last account written by the hand of one of the 3 persons originally involved in the controversy. Nothing further was learned of either James Scotford or of Bishop Etzenhauser. Since 1924, sporadic reference has appeared in print concerning these relics. In an issue dated December 20, 1925, the New York Times devoted a double-page spread to bogus relics of the past and counterfeits foisted on the public, including among counterfeits such as the famous Cardiff Giant. These Michigan relics received lengthy comment. The Times article stated that Walter C. Wyman, of Wyman, Michigan, an amateur archaeologist who had been a collector of relics for some 40 years, ruled this group of artifacts to be fraudulent, according to the New York Times. Mr. Wyman got into communication with Scotford under an assumed name, and finally, without indicating his intention, paid the paper hanger a visit at his Michigan home. Scotford was busy that day. He was at work in his shed, and so the archaeologist came upon him unexpectedly, surrounded by curious objects in various states of manufacture. He was not at all embarrassed. Mr. Wyman said the other day, and tried to sell me for $100 a stone casket bearing hieroglyphics. I didn't like to say that I knew he was a faker, and gave various excuses, but before I left the place, he offered me the casket at the bargain rate of $25. I managed to escape him somehow and walked 3 miles into the snow so as to get out of town and away from his importunities. Subsequently, I warned the priest who had been buying these forgeries and who had an attic full of them, as well as other customers. Since then, Mr. Wyman has greatly increased his collection and has turned over the bulk of the authentic objects to the Field Museum of Chicago. The pieces which he regards so obvious fakes, and which he acquires sometimes by purchase, sometimes by confiscation, he sends to the Department of Forgeries in the Smithsonian. Dean Savage died in the early 1930s. The Detroit News published a biographical sketch on him, in part stating, "It is perhaps through his pursuit of Michigan's archaeology that he gained his greatest reputation as a scientist and established his most important friendships. He was always interested, even as a boy, having Indian relics. This collection grew with the years, and he had one time, before he transferred them to a museum, some of the finest collections of Indian arrowheads and axes in the Middle West. Nearly all of these were found in Wayne and Crawford counties. It was following the discovery of 3,000 objects of an earlier civilization than that of the American Indian that Dean Savage and his associate discoverers became the center of a controversy regarding the genuineness of the discovery. These objects were of slate, copper stone, and a few of dry clay. While the controversy waged, Dean Savage had as his correspondents and friends such men as John Hayes Hammond, Warren K. Moorhead, Sir John Lubbock of England, Dr. Bourguignon, French Commissioner for Exploration, and Rabbi Morgenstern of Cincinnati. Dean Savage's position as a collector of these objects was clear. He made no claim for any of the objects he unearthed. He merely wanted to gather together before civilization wiped out the record, as many of these objects as was possible, and then turned these over to specialists. The controversy died down and was soon forgotten after several archaeologists of international standing identified the objects as belonging to a civilization which many historians believe preceded that of the American Indian on this continent. A book published in 1946 entitled Hoaxes and devoting space to these Michigan artifacts contributed a few conjectures of its own to the already kaleidoscopic picture. Following accounts of the day, the author reviewed the story much as he found a journalistic version headlined in Detroit newspapers. He noted, Old World surely wrote his diary on carbon paper. Was the heading given by the Detroit Daily News to one of a series of stories, with which it helped to expose an extensive fake relic ring in 1907? This antique factory was remarkable for the men involved as for the ingenious methods employed to obtain eyewitness testimonials to archaeological finds in all parts of Michigan. According to the news, the scheme is so unique as to win absolute admiration for the perpetrators. If committed in a spirit of humor, it is the most colossal hoax of the century. Last noted of published material concerning these Michigan artifacts appeared under the date of April 18, 1953, when a small brochure titled Michigan's Controversial Finds, written by A.L. or Al Spooner, son of Harry L. Spooner, was published by the Aboriginal Research Club of Detroit. Al Spooner, it will be remembered, was present with his father when Mr. Soper opened his last mound at Halfway in September 1920. In his monograph, A.L. Spooner included unpublished private correspondence between his father and Mr. Soper, Dr. W.K. Moorhead, and Dean Savage, among others. In his summation of historical background, A.L. Spooner ends his invaluable account with the statement that he himself has no answers to the authenticity of the inscribed artifacts. In his own words, he states, I might add that my father never finished his investigations because he couldn't find the answers either. In November 1953, Harry L. Spooner gave a spirited talk reviewing the history of the alleged Soper frauds before the anthropology section of the Peoria Academy of Sciences, telling at some length of the last mound opening at Halfway. Mr. Phillips Shoup of Chicago was present with his 5 specimens of inscribed copper remaining from Professor Worth's original collection. Present also was Judge Claude Stone of Peoria, who for many years had special interest in these relics. These 3 men spoke earnestly. All held strong convictions that the material was authentic and not forged, but could offer no explanation as to how it might have come to be buried in the heart of Michigan. This author was also present at the meeting. Judge Stone believed the material to be authentic, but said he was unable to prove it. Knowing of my background in this field, he asked if I would examine the writing and if I also found it to be authentic. Could I prove it? I told him yes. If it were authentic, I could prove it. And this book is the result. All right? And we're going to get into some really interesting info on the next chapters. I just wanted to get an introduction to the book, guys. I don't want to make the video too long. We're going to do many parts, reading the different chapters, so we can get into the whole book. A lot of drop going to come out of this, and a lot of artifacts you never knew about, archaeology that they've hidden. You know, they put brushed under the rug. They didn't want us to know about these things. It doesn't fit their curriculum. It doesn't fit their narratives of out of Africa, of the cradle of civilization being Mesopotamia over there on that desert over there. It doesn't fit their lives. So they've hidden this stuff, guys. All right. So I hope you enjoyed the reading. We did the prologue, the forward. We read chapters 1 and 2. Just want to get you your feet wet with the info, the whole history behind it. You know, that's very good context to have to understand. You know, they've never been able to disprove these artifacts. They just brushed them off and hid them. They just said, oh, they're frauds with no proof. So that's the main thing I wanted everybody to kind of like realize. All right, the mystic symbol. All right, the Most High, Jehovah, the mystic symbol, Jehovah, mark of the Michigan Mound Builders. I'm gonna end it right there. I'll see you guys on the next chapter of this series, but we got many more videos to come. You know, every day we're looking for fresh material, but we also want to, you know, make sure we finish other investigations we got going. And I appreciate everybody, all of you guys that take the time to stick around all the way to the end of the videos and hear my little speeches at the end, like right now. But I appreciate all of you in the live chat as well, seeing this live. Thanks to all the moderators, thanks to all my new channel members and my existing channel members, my Patreon supporters, all you guys holding me up. YouTube makes it a little hard sometimes, you know, to make a living out of this, but I appreciate you guys for the love very, very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. You guys have a great weekend or a strong end. Not a weekend. You guys have a strong end this next 2 days, right? Shabbat Shalom. Give thanks. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Hawa.